So I guess this is going to be a very sort of quite casually run session. This was initially, our preparation for this was we went for a drink, and so we're going to try and replay that conversation in a sober environment now. But yeah, so I guess we'll basically give an overview of our careers, what we've been up to essentially over the last sort of 10 years or so each, and the sort of journeys we've taken, and then our experiences of working beyond academia, so in jobs that aren't in the academy. And we've both done both had quite odd career trajectories, I think it's fair to say. So we're talking about the rewards and challenges and difficulties of doing so, and particularly we're interested in, I think, how what you learn from doing a master's, PhD, other scholarship in STIS, how that can be really useful and often quite difficult, but in a productive way when applied to other jobs. So what we're going to do is talk for about, we'll see how much sort of fuel we've got, probably talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up and hopefully start a discussion with the wider room. But yeah, do you want to go first then in terms of an introduction to your career?
So yeah, Paul, I think I know quite a lot of you here, but if you don't, my name is Rhodri Leng. I did a PhD in STIS starting in 2016, finished around 2020, and then did a postdoctoral fellowship in the department. So I've had quite a zigzaggy career, like many people will. I got my undergraduate in politics from Glasgow. I did a master's in political and legal theory in York, and then for a period worked as an advisor and assistant to two MPs in the House of Commons and the Scottish Parliament. And that was my first route really out of academia. After doing an undergraduate and a master's in politics, I decided that I wanted to kind of get some first-hand experience of what politics was like. Very much enjoyed that, did that for 2 years, but then got a little bit frustrated with the short-termism of politics. And I got my research interest there while I was doing that job, which was, I got very interested in how evidence is used in policy, and the kind of origin of that evidence and what makes it robust and what makes decisions robust. And so I decided to apply for a PhD at Edinburgh. My PhD focused really on understanding the spread of scientific evidence through several different debates. After my postdoc, I think I wanted to stay in academia. I definitely did, and I think I regard myself as an academic, but as everybody knows, things are difficult. I was approached at the end of my postdoc to work for a large asset management firm in Edinburgh, which I'm now a research analyst at. So my job consists really of advising investors about certain emerging technologies, the evidence base behind those technologies, putting investors really into contact with academics. So we fund quite a lot of research. So a lot of my job consists in doing research still, but it's a lot more compact than before, and normally I don't have a huge amount of freedom as you do in academia to choose what topics you're going to pursue. I also get to speak to academics quite a lot in my day-to-day job. Now, how has STS really helped me get into that job? Well, I think STIS is really very unusual in the sense that you've been trained to often cover topics that you are not yourself necessarily expert in, or at least initially you won't be. So you have to approach a topic from a kind of outsider's perspective and analyze it in a way that is useful and can communicate it to different audiences. And I think that's really the core and most important skill. And there's methodological skills that are important, interviewing people, being able to read academic articles, scientific articles. Lots of people won't even try and read a scientific article. But there's also quantitative skills or time management skills, people skills, being able to talk to crowds or being able to teach to your colleagues are hugely valued in industry, in part because a lot of people might not have those skills or feel a little bit more nervous about approaching new topics or new audiences than I think people at STIS necessarily do. So that's me very, very briefly. Ben.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess so mine, in some ways, I always think of myself as having a very odd career path, but I think for STIS, it's actually quite traditional. So my original master's degree was in chemistry with a focus in biochem. So I was saying to someone at my master's lab research in 2012 was doing gene knockout studies at our mass spectrometry lab in Edinburgh. But I graduated around the time of, it was still the sort of tail end of the financial crisis. There weren't a lot of jobs in, in sort of academia and industry, and across the course of my degree I'd been engaging in a lot of student activism, and I was increasingly sort of disillusioned with being a sort of full-time hard scientist. And so I decided to take a conversion master's into criminology, so that was at Edinburgh. And that is a type of criminology which is not the sort of what Americans would call criminology, so rather than sort of crime science or crime studies, it's very much sort of the sociology of crime and deviance, with a particular focus on institutions, so very critical, a lot of radical theory, a lot of social theory. So I got a real love of social theory there. Following my master's, so my now husband was going off to do a PhD at the time, and we basically only had money for one of us to do that at a time. So to support him, I basically applied for a job at the civil service in Scotland. And then he actually had an academic job when I did my PhD, so he could support me then. So I spent 4 years working for Transport Scotland, so as a Scottish government statistician. So that was as essentially a research analyst, and I more or less used my sort of quantitative skills from the chemistry masters, and it means you can do stats, it means you can do programming. So I had a role there, and a lot of the things that really surprised me about that role. So I'd been kind of sort of in an academic track all the way up to that point, was that I was hired as a statistician. I was hired on the basis of quantitative skills, and that was roughly 1% of my job. Almost none of it was involved in the sort of, do the hardest thing you can think of doing. Like really push yourself, challenge yourself intellectually in that way. Most of the job was about people management, it was about integrating with policy, it was about working with big sort of policy systems, collecting, gathering evidence, and developing sort of research agendas, which I found really interesting, and engaging with politics, which was very interesting, although extremely stressful. So then I applied for my PhD, and I did that in between STIS and the law school at Edinburgh. Actually, my supervisor is sitting at the back, James Stewart. So yeah, and I did that alongside part of the time I was working at government, and I found that I did find the stuff I was learning there really useful, which we can maybe go into a bit later on. When I then went off to do a postdoc down in Cambridge at their Cybercrime Studies Centre, and then something quite odd happened during the pandemic. Effectively during the pandemic, I was working at the PhD and finishing up my PhD and work as a postdoc, and then obviously the pandemic hit, and my old boss gave me an email saying we desperately need statisticians. I think this was in week 2 of lockdown, and he said, if you want to come up to Edinburgh, we've got a job for you. So I worked for 9 months in our kind of COVID modelling team, which was very, very interesting, extremely stressful. I was also doing my postdoc at the same time, so I think I was working about an 80-hour week between the 2 jobs. But it was really good fun, and really, you certainly learned a lot from doing that. And then I got, so I'm now, at the end of that, I got a lectureship in STIS at Edinburgh, and so I'm now a lecturer in digital methods. I think the biggest challenge, I think, for me working outside of the academy, and it's the thing I had to get used to, was I'd been really used to sort of like trying to find stuff that was like really personally, intellectually challenging to me, or about developing a particular skill, or really kind of pushing myself forwards. And that's very much not that's really useful for you. That's not necessarily, I think you have to get used to is, that's not what the most useful thing is for a business necessarily all the time. It's not necessarily what your personal development is important to them, but ultimately they will have other things motivating what they do, and often it's more useful for them, for you to do something that you find personally quite easy and are quite good at, over and over again, to produce things that are actually useful for them. And that does take getting used to. It can be very frustrating when you start. You learn to see why it's valuable though. And if you're working in a place that you believe in and where you believe in the goals of the business or in government, that is something that you do adapt to, I think. In terms of what the value of STS, I think we can talk more about this, but for me, it's really that kind of, having said that, the ability to move from sort of doing analysis to producing insight, I think is the thing that people find really valuable about our skill set. I think a lot of people are trained to analyse something and produce a set of analytical products, and a lot of people go into industry, go into government with that ability. I think particularly the lens on theory, the emphasis on critical thought, that gives you a set of skills that's actually really, really valuable outside the academy to say, well, actually, what's the thing you really need to know here that's going to make most of the difference? That really should be structuring at a broad level how you think about this thing. And that's, I think, something that people find very valuable, both in business and in government, although it can also annoy the hell out of them as well. So yeah, I guess to start off, like, what would you say the biggest challenges you face then are in terms of tailoring that skill set moving into these jobs?
I would agree with you. The repetition is a thing that you do have to get used to. So in policy, that was writing policy briefs or writing letters to constituents, which is actually a large part of the job. So that's, yeah, jobs always sound sexier than they are. And so when you actually do them, a lot of it is things that are reasonably routine, but that is what's expected. You know, if you've got a job, you're there to perform a particular function. I think getting used to what that function is and how to do it in a way that is interesting and then aligns with your goals is challenging. You know, you have a set of personal ambitions and the way that you want to develop, but then there's what is useful. I think the other challenge is that I still very much regard myself as an academic. And so I think I have a mindset that when I research something, my temptation is to go very deep into it, which is not always what is useful for other people. You know, if you want to understand that 100 different dimensions of a particular issue, but they really just want to know a very specific piece of information, then it is about managing, okay, I'm finding this interesting, but it's not useful. And I think that I'm still learning really of what is useful, and that's really communicating with who asked you to do a job and say, what do you actually want from this? Because often, a lot of the time, people ask you to do something and their question isn't particularly specific. So you've got to train yourself to basically be like, okay, but what do you really want from this? Or getting into the habit of sending people earlier drafts of things.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
So they can say, no, don't go down this alley, go down something else, because this is not the direction.
Which is very hard when you move back into the academy, I find, because now when I do, as James will know extremely well, when I do pieces of writing, I send back like a really early unfinished draft right away, just to get this sort of sketchy outline, because that is what you should do if you're producing something that's going to go out to the public. You bat around those early ideas. Academics I think, find that quite frustrating, because they look at it and they say, what on earth is this garbage you've said? Like, so it can be very, yeah, sorry, James. But I think, yeah, they can learn to work with us as well, clearly. But yeah, I think as well, there is that aspect of, so the repetition, I think, is a tough thing. But I think particularly because in STIS you're often learning such an ethnographic skill set and set of sensibilities, I think this is very common for academics that go into practice, is you become essentially, all the time you're always also being an ethnographer of your own professional life. And so you're sort of doing this stuff and you're immersing into this professional community, into this social world, and you're thinking, oh, this is really interesting, like actually this is how it works, you're sort of almost doing that kind of auto-ethnography all the time, I find. And particularly, I'm not sure, well, maybe you'll say the same in terms of the policy side, but particularly my engagements with policy, the first thing I found about working in government and in policy was this works completely differently to how academics that write about this think it works. It's completely different. And that is, it's a really rich set of experiences you can have working in the academy, for going from the academy to practice, whether it's in the private sector, in the public sector, or in the third sector, is you actually get to see how things really work. That not in an interview setting, not even in an ethnographic setting, you're actually doing the job. So yeah, I don't know how you feel about that.
Oh, I completely agree. I think that you have to learn to put your critical academic hat aside every so often. So part of my job is calculating risk metrics and quantitative risk analysis. And you can go down blind kind of alleys by questioning what does this metric really mean. But really, a lot of these metrics are for regulatory purposes anyway, so you're just to produce them and not question them. But I definitely think that it is that self-awareness of what it is you're doing and trying to overanalyze it can annoy other people.
Yeah, you also have to learn how to be managed. That is a thing. You do get addicted to it though.
I'm still not very good at being managed, I don't think. So.
Yeah, but you were never, so I was a civil servant for 4 years, and you do become addicted to being managed. I found that the hardest thing going into academia was, wait, I don't have a monthly conversation with my boss and we evaluate everything I did for the past month? Like, what am I meant to do? But you do, yeah, I think that takes a lot of getting used to, I think.
But yeah, definitely. But I think one of the great things of going out and working, and I think in some ways for social scientists, it's hopefully that there becomes a culture where it's easier to transition and hop between academia and industry, because I do think you get a very different perspective of how things work. I mean, I think most jobs I've had are more like organized chaos. They kind of work in ways that you're not really sure even how they're put together sometimes. And you get in there and there's, legacies of somebody put a particular system in 20 years ago and it's still having kind of impacts within the firm, and people have developed their own norms and habits of working. So everywhere I've worked, and even within different teams within the same company, they'll function very, very differently. And so that, I think, for a social scientist can be stressful as well, because you want there to be rules and you want things to play by some kind of clearer narrative, but often that's much harder to see when you're actually in it. And whether that's just from a practitioner's perspective, and there is a kind of broader structuring force going on, would be an interesting academic paper, but not interesting if you're working in the industry, probably.
Yes, there is also the question of impact, I think, as well, and that is one of the big benefits of working in industry, in government, etc., is you have impact in a way that, in an extremely direct way. So particularly in government, if you produce a bit of briefing paper, it can directly allocate hundreds of thousands of pounds, well, in your case, a lot more, I think it fits. But, and that is, when you are actually dealing with those things that really have that type of immediate impact, you're a lot more, in a way you have a lot more power in terms of you can actually do things that have an effect on the world, but you're hugely more constrained. And one of the insights you really get working in policy or working in industry is you see why decisions are made the way they are. Because to us in the academy, you say, well, why on earth are they not doing this? Why is this clearly this best policy or this best decision? Why haven't they taken that decision? And when you are actually dealing with the reality of, like, this will affect potentially tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people's lives, you realize that actually the decisions you make are mostly constrained by organizational imperatives, work across the organization, relationships between you and your colleagues, other things that have to be taken into account. Political priorities is a big one there.
I think time commitments.
Yeah, indeed.
I mean, a lot of working in industry or policy is you have to be able to explain a complex topic to someone who's not going to do that research themselves. So if you write 10,000 word paper on something and give it to them, that's not going to really have any impact at all.
No.
It's just not. Nobody has time to read that. And so so some decisions come because they're easier to get your head around. Then
Very
have to
much.
reopen stuff, and everybody then has to commit more and more and more time to really figuring out what to do.
I think that's very important, both for getting your first job outside the academy, but also for actually doing a good job in these roles. Is that, so when I went to government, I 5 years doing kind of like a lot of pure maths in my chemistry degree. I knew a lot of statistics. I really boned up on all my weird structural equation modeling, matrix theory, all that to try and impress them at the interview. And then the first day of my job, I said, oh, well, we'll do this analysis using some multi-level statistical modeling. And they said, no, you won't. The minister does not understand multi-level structured equations. You'll be doing percentages. At preference, 3 percentages maximum. And so, I mean, but that's when you, that is something you have to learn how to do, is essentially that communication. And that can be very frustrating because you want to do the stuff that shows how smart you are and how good at your job you are and why it's really vital that they keep you there. But I mean, I remember I spent a whole year doing this very complex sort of Bayesian modelling around transport. And the thing that actually made the decision for the minister very clear was we went to them with a PowerPoint presentation that had one slide that said the top 3% of earners do 30% of the AMLs. And that's a much more powerful way to make a case. And it's something that's exactly the same in business because they're not going to understand extremely, 10,000 pages of Foucault or whatever it might be.
Oh, I think, yeah. But I think there's that simplicity, and it's a good skill to learn of how to simplify and translate knowledge in a way that engages the person you're actually trying to impact and advise. That, I think, is a skill that you develop in industry, but I think it is something that, a background in STIS does help you to do, because you've had to translate knowledge in different contexts in lots of different ways. And you do you have the kind of skills and techniques to be able to find out that information and gather that information. But I think it is that maybe the virtues of a working industry is it kind of adds another dimension to that skill set of how do you turn this into a tool for other people.
Yeah, I think it's definitely not about not doing. It's not like you go into industry and suddenly you're playing with Lego blocks. You can still do really complicated stuff. You can still think about it in that way. They've hired you because you have this skill set, because it is valuable. But it's about figuring out how you actually communicate that in a meaningful way to people who are not stupid. These are smart people. It's just that the language they speak, the way they understand things is different to yours. And just as specialised in a different way. I think, I always think of, so I now, despite my personal politics around the police and law enforcement, weirdly I now so I do a lot of very critical research, but I now get quite a lot of contact with the police and weirdly the FBI. And so I remember the FBI asked me for advice on something last year. They do not pay me. My hackers would not continue to do interviews with me if I was taking money from the bureau. But yes, so they, I basically wanted to argue to them that they should stop doing arrests on this particular group of people because it wasn't really doing anything, and they were just putting people into the criminal justice system. And we did a bunch of analysis, and I used some Marxist theory and a bunch of stuff. I didn't put that in the thing I gave to them, but it was useful in making the case to them. And I think I've often found that they can get anyone to give them a really simple analysis. But it's when you can sort of like layer in some of that more complex sort of insights in a way that's understandable to them, that brings them stuff they've never heard of. And that can often really transform the way people understand a social problem, a decision. And I think it's figuring out how to do that in a way that retains your credibility, doesn't alienate people, is really hard but really valuable. Which I know you were saying that you've had quite a lot of, this has been your experience quite a lot within your current job, is trying to bring these sort of more critical perspectives in, but the challenges of actually communicating that.
I think, I have a tendency to write too much, go into unnecessary detail in my current job. And there's something that I've had to learn, just like everything in life, leaving academia, you're going to have to learn a lot of other skills. But I think that having that kind of background in STIS gives you a good foundation to build on. But yeah, so it is that, what do I find? I mean, one of the really interesting things is I work for I suppose my expectation of industry would be that they'd be very, very high tech. So it would be, and I do quite a lot of quantitative work. So I was expecting kind of Python and R, that's what I'd be working with. But no, it's still Excel. And so probably the most valuable thing you can do if you want to get a job in industry is just brush up on Excel.
Yeah, that's
do you know
government. Yeah.
Honestly, everybody still uses it because you've got generations of people across a farm, and so if you're like, oh, I did this in R, they're like, what? I can't read code, or I want to be able to edit this or play around with the data, so do it in Excel. That was a persistent annoyance for me for the first bit, but I kind of got used to it. But I think it is that's the case. I think what's useful for you if you're thinking of working in industry is that you probably won't know what it's like until you go out and try, and you shouldn't be afraid of doing it. You will have a huge amount of skills that you don't even know that you have from being in academia. So time management, being able to reach out to new people, to be able to pick up new methods or new topics very, very quickly. And these are really that kind of analytical and critical thinking skills that we say a lot in student examinations, and sometimes it's difficult to really pin them down, but they definitely are there.
The other big thing, I think, is use your master's thesis. Make sure you use your master's thesis. Effectively, when you go into industry, you'll often have done something for your master's thesis that is quite contemporary, that is a sustained, intensive research project over 6 months, whenever it was. And to people working in industry and government, you are an expert in the thing you did your master's thesis in. And they perceive you as being an expert in the thing you did that in. Whereas, so I got told when I was, this may be Cambridge talk, but I got told when I was doing my postdoc, they said, you are an expert in the thing that you did your master's thesis in, and you are the world expert in the thing you did your PhD thesis on. So, I wouldn't necessarily represent it like that, but it's like the topic-specific, domain-specific stuff that you've learned in your master's degree, and especially in your thesis, is immensely valuable, and you will get a chance to draw on it, you will get a chance to deploy it, and like, don't be afraid to push that in the interview, to push it in when you actually have the job, to be like, well, actually, no, this is something I know like a great deal about, this was my like thesis expertise, and like that is extremely valuable, and often so when we're speaking to our master's students, we often suggest they do things in their masters that are tailored to the job that they would like to eventually be doing, because it will come up in the interview. It will be something they look at when they're sorting through CVs, etc.
I think being able to talk comfortably about a topic that you know a lot and that you can demonstrate that you've got that commitment to research something for 3-6 months is a lot of jobs. If you're going for research analyst jobs, if you're going for policy advising jobs, a lot of the time you won't be given 6 months to do research, but the fact that you can do that is really what they're after. I would say in some ways, in my job, I don't stress my expertise in particular areas, in part because I think it puts people off. People want to speak to people that they feel that they can have a conversation with. And so if you come and you say, I am an expert, it can be, right, especially investors. Investors probably know many people who are more expert in anything that you think you know. You know, that they invest in companies, you don't know more than them, probably, on the thing that they've invested in for 10 years, right? They already know this. So it is, I think, just gauging that audience of, when do I lean on my expertise and make that point, and when do I say, actually, I don't know. I think you have to get very comfortable in saying, I don't know very much about this, but I can find you the answer. I think that kind of intellectual honesty from being an academic, and that intellectual credibility, that you won't offer advice and you won't return reports that are based on shoddy work. I think that's, in some ways, that served me well to say, actually, no, I don't know anything about this, so I'm not going to say anything.
That is definitely useful. So you can tell the government bit, because in government you're always dealing with generalists. you're never dealing with someone that has like genuine long-term expertise in something unless you're commissioning them to do something. But I think the point about intellectual honesty does work across both. It's something that is extremely valued by people, I think. So we've actually probably should go to some audience questions.